today actually I'm going to cover about relative pronouns. So in many situations we use relative pronouns either in conversational use or either it be a normal written form of usage. So we often use relative pronouns. So what relative pronouns actually does it? They introduce the relative clauses. So relative clauses are nothing but the dependent clauses. So whenever we actually talk about something, what happens is we might not every sentence we talk is actually independent sentence. Sometimes it needs a supporting statement as well, because when you talk about something which the other person doesn't know, you bring some context, and then the same statement which you have passed, it is supported by another statement. So we have actually discussed a couple of months ago where I said independent clauses, when we introduce two independent clauses, it is actually joined by a comma and a coordinating conjunction. So the same way. So before I start the topic, I just wanted to know from you guys. So there are two statements here. So I would like to know from you, after reading these two statements, I'll give you 4 options. You have to choose one of the options from those 4 options. So option A, the first option is the first statement is right. Option B, the second statement is right. Option C, both of these statements are right. Or option D, none of them are right. So once please read it and let me know which one do you think is right, which option is suitable in this context.
The first one is right.
Okay. Any other answer?
Both seem right to me, but first one seems more right.
Option E, yeah. Okay. Okay. So many times we often see that and which are interchangeably used in many different contexts whenever we use relative pronouns. So if you see, there are 2 types of clauses actually whenever we talk about relative pronouns. One is restrictive relative clause, another is unrestrictive relative clause. What happens in restrictive one is whatever the information comes after that, or after which, usually whatever the information, the dependent clause is the information which we convey, if that cannot be omitted, and that is very much important to the statement because that is what we want to convey the meaning, so that becomes a restrictive relative clause. Unrestrictive is we can even omit them, that just adds an extra information which might not be important in the statement, but it just adds. So if you see here in the first statement, the school that burned down last week is still smoking. So the thing which came after that, so that is a relative pronoun here, and the thing which it is modifying is the relative clause. If you see, the school that burned down last week is still smoking. So just think, if you eliminate burned down last week and just read the sentence, if it is making any sense or not. Like the school is still smoking, so it still does not give any proper context. Like, so burned down last week is actually important to this statement, and same happens with this thing also. So whenever we face such a situation where the component or the thing which you are mentioning, it is very much important and it falls into the restrictive relative clause, we have to use that is the preferable option, not which. And which would be used in different contexts, we'll discuss about that. And so whenever the burn down last week in this sentence, so whenever the clause, the restrictive relative clause, which is very much important or which is the main gist of the sentence we are talking about, then that is used mostly. So that's how the relative pronouns actually add value to the sentence, and we'll see multiple examples how it could be used in different ways. So as I said, relative pronouns are nothing but who, whom, whomever, or who's, that, or which. So whenever we talk about a dependent clause or independent clause, we often use these things to actually give clarity about whom we are talking, which place we are talking to, which thing we are talking to, in which context we are talking to. So relative pronouns, usually they compare and they give more clarity to the reader or the opposite person whom we are talking to. So as I said, relative pronouns introduce relative clauses. So they are like dependent clauses. So both of them, they need a supporting statement, and the supporting statement is supported by a relative pronoun like who, whom, whoever, that, etc. So relative clauses actually modify a word or a phrase or some idea usually. As I said, the idea modified is called as antecedent, and the thing which is modifying is called relative pronoun. Here, if you see in this sentence, the house that Jack built is large. The professor whom I respect recently received a tenure. And one thing we have to remember is that whenever there is a restricted relative clause, means whenever the statement which we are talking about, if it is important to the statement, or if it is the main gist of the sentence, we doesn't need any comma here. Most of the times what we do is we say the house and we put comma and we say that Jack built is large. No, that is not actually required. So whenever the two dependent sentences are there, and if this first statement and the second statement, both of them are important for the sentence to actually convey a meaning, then we don't need a comma here. But if you see in the second sentence, the professor whom I respect recently received tenure. If you see here, whom I respect, you just have to question yourself, I respect, does it actually adding any meaning to the sentence? Or if you can eliminate this, or if you can omit this, does the statement still remain the same? If you feel that even if omitting this sentence, omitting that particular part, if you feel the sentence still remains the same, the main gist of the sentence is not altered, then that means it is unrestrictive relative clause, which means it has to be separated by comma, which means it is not adding any essential information. So here in this case, Jack built is large. It is an essential information of the statement. So that is why we don't need comma. If it is non-essential information, just add some extra value. So for example, if I say the car which is in red color is going fast, or something which talks about the characteristics or features which might not be very essential for the statements, those things are separated by a comma whenever we have a relative pronoun there. So this is how we have to see this. And we'll see.
Just to add, right, one more rule that I came across this a long time back. So when we use that word that, or to distinguish between the usage of that and which, one tip that we can remember is the pronoun, if it is referring to the word that is immediately preceding to that. So the house that Jack built, right? So that word that is referring to the house. Right. For example, let us say you have something like the house on road number 10 Jubilee Hills or something like that. Then there you use which. I heard something like that, because the house on road number 10 Jubilee Hills which Jack built. So the which refers to the house, not Jubilee Hills. Right. So the word that is used to refer, so if you have a set of words before the pronoun, the immediately preceding word, if you want to refer to that, then you use that. Otherwise you use which. That is something that I have heard.
Right. So the thing which Sai has mentioned is actually very much important for the relative pronouns topic. So basically what he means is, whenever the house, here in this case, the house is the subject that is talking about the subject. In some cases, that or which actually talks about, the relative pronoun talks about the object. So that part is in the coming slides. So I'll explain it in very clear manner in the coming slide. And that is very much important to understand the relative pronouns, how relative pronouns change depending upon the subject or object which it is referring to, and how that or which are used when object and subject actually interchange. So I'll talk about in the coming slides. So I'll continue from here. So if you see here, as I mentioned, there are broadly there are two types of relative clauses. One is restrictive one, defining clause. Another is non-restrictive, which is non-defining. So restrictive ones are actually the things which provide the essential information, the thing which we want to communicate to the other person or to the other readers who read it. So the essential information is called as restrictive clause, and things like non-essential information, which usually talk about features or other characteristics, some extra information that it just adds some extra information, which might not be important, but still they add it. That would be non-restrictive, non-defining clauses. So in both types of clauses, sometimes relative pronoun can function as a subject, sometimes as an object, and sometimes as a possessive pronoun. Like we'll see those with examples. I think it gives more clarity then. So relative pronouns specifically focused on restrictive relative clauses, we'll see. So as I said, relative pronouns usually introduce a restrictive relative clause. Introduce a relative clause, which is the dependent clause. If it is restrictive relative clause, if it is essential information, then it is not separated by a comma. It is the first rule which we have to remember. So whenever we use that or this thing, if the information which comes after the relative pronoun, like after that or something, then if it is essential information, then we should not separate it by comma. That is the rule. So we can just simply say the house that burned down last week is still smoking. So it doesn't need a comma. You can just simply say it. So that is the thing. That's the first rule in this relative pronouns, specifically in the context of restrictive relative clauses. And as I said, restrictive relative clauses are also called as defining clauses, which adds essential information about the antecedent, which means the subject. So the information is crucial for understanding, that cannot be omitted. If it is omitted, then we cannot understand the whole sentence meaning. That is the thing. So once we read it, if we feel that the information, because we are the person who write, or we are the person who read, if you think the information which is passed, if it is information or if it is the main gist of the sentence, then it cannot have a comma. And if you see the table here, this table actually talks about some of the rules which you have to remember when we introduce the relative pronouns, specifically focused on restrictive relative clauses. If you see, in case of subject, if we are referring to a people, we'll say who that. So for example, the guy who won the Olympics is actually the guy who won the Olympics in javelin is from India. So if you see who is referred to the person, I'm basically talking about the subject is talking about the person, and who and that is used in different contexts depending upon which one is more relevant. And in case of things or concepts, which and that is used. And in case of object, then what happens is that, who, and whom is also used. And in case of things, which and that is used. So this table might confuse us, because the moment we look at it, subject or object or things, when we look at this table, it might confuse us to remember the things. But when we see the examples and when we remember some rules, it will be easy to, it will easily fit into our subconscious mind. We don't actually have to remember this, but this gives more clarity if we prepare, if we look at it once, if we are going to solve it. So relative pronouns as a subject in the relative clauses. So we'll see relative pronouns in the context of relative clauses, especially when they are talking about the subject. So if you see the first sentence here, this is the house that had a great Christmas decoration. So here if you see the house is actually the subject. So that is actually referring to the subject. So the relative pronouns is actually talking about the subject, and this is the dependent clause, which is the main gist of the sentence. So that is why we don't see any comma here. We just simply say this is the house that had a great Christmas decoration. So this is the subject, and this is the dependent clause, and this is the relative pronoun. In the second sentence, if you see, it took me a while to get used to people who eat popcorn during the movie. So basically, who is actually referring to the people. So it took me a while. Me is not the subject here. Me is actually the object here. So whenever we have active, as we know, active voice and passive voice, usually active voices start with the subject and passive voice starts with the object. So here in this case, we are referring to the people. So this becomes a subject here, and who is actually referring to the people who eat popcorn. So basically the person actually wants to convey that it took him a while to get used to the people who eat popcorn. So every information here in this case is actually adding some value. We cannot omit the sentence after the who. We cannot omit after things which are before, which is preceding before the relative pronoun. So all of these falls under the restricted relative clauses. They are dependent clauses, and they actually providing essential information here. So that is the reason there is no comma here in this case. And we'll see relative pronouns used as an object. Earlier we talked about the subject. Here we'll see relative pronouns used in the context of restrictive relative clauses focused on objects. So whenever we, in most of the cases, it is not necessary that we have to use that or which whenever we are talking about the relative clause. Sometimes we can omit the relative pronoun as well, especially in the case of objects. So if you see here, whenever the relative pronoun is an object, it is not the subject. It plays an object role. Relative pronoun is object, or especially if there is a preposition preceding before the relative pronoun. Like for example, which is used instead of that. As Sai was mentioning in the previous example, whenever relative pronoun is talking about the subject, that is more used. Whenever relative pronoun is talking about the object, which is more used. So that is the distinction here. And especially there is another rule which we have to remember. The third rule is whenever the relative pronoun is if it is preceding by a preposition, almost all the cases we have to use which, not that. We should not say in that or for that or about that, because there is a preposition. So after the introduction of preposition, the relative pronoun which comes is actually which, not that. We'll see them with examples. And one more thing is, whenever we are referring to a person or thing, in that case, relative pronoun may be omitted if it is talking about the object. I'll show some examples here. So if you see mostly in formal English, if you see, this is the man to whom I wanted to speak, whose name I had forgotten. So this is the formal English which people actually use. This is the man to whom I wanted to speak, or whose name I had forgotten. But when it comes to conversational use, we don't actually use many rules, or we don't make it so formal, because it's conversational use. We actually omit certain things. So if you see here, this is the man I wanted to speak to whom, this is the man I wanted to speak to and whose name I had forgotten. So if you see, there is no whom here. We have eliminated. And that is acceptable also. So whenever in the we are using it in the conversational use, we can omit whom. But in case of formal English, especially when we are writing it either in the email form or either in any case study form, then whom is actually preferred, because that is the proper English. That's how we say. But in case of informal English, you can simply omit the, because you are referring to a person, this thing. And if you see the another example, the library did not have the book that I wanted. In case of informal English, as I said, because it is referring to a thing, person or thing, we can simply eliminate that. You can simply say the library didn't have the book I wanted. In informal English or in conversational use, you can say that. And in the third example, if you see, this is the house where or in which I lived when I first came to the United States. So as I said, whenever you introduce any preposition and the thing, the relative pronoun which comes after the preposition is which, not that. So you can say, this is the house in which I lived when I first came to United States. You cannot say, this is the house in that I lived when I first came to United States. That is not the actual use. So whenever the introduction of preposition is there, which actually takes place instead of that. Or you can simply say in the conversational use, you can simply eliminate the relative pronoun. You can say, this is the house I lived in when I first came to the United States. So there are some more additional use actually cases. So actually in American English, whom is very often used, and whom is actually preferred thing actually when we are talking about person, or especially when it is in the object form or when it is in the passive form. So whom is more formal than who, and we'll see them that with some examples here. So that if you see this example, the woman to whom you have just spoken is my teacher. So this is actually the grammatically correct sentence. The woman to whom you have just spoken is my teacher. In the conversational use, you will say the woman you have just spoken to is my teacher. Both of them are correct, but whom is more preferred in American English? Whom is more often used in proper English or in grammatically correct or maybe the formal usage, you can simply, we have to whom is more preferred then rather than omitting it or making it informal. So whenever you are indulging in any formal activity like writing a mail or writing any case study or maybe some white paper, whom is more often preferred because it gives more context or more clarity to the reader that whom that person is referring to. So this is the preferred one. In case of conversational use, you can simply say the woman you have just spoken to is my teacher, or you can simply say the woman who you have just spoken to is my teacher. So sometimes they use who also, but whom is more preferred and it is more formal actually. So there is one more rule. So if whom is preceded by a preposition, then you cannot omit the whom. Either it be in the conversational use, either it be in the regular informal use, or either be the formal use. If you see here, the visitor for whom you were waiting has arrived. So if you simply say the visitor for you were waiting has arrived, it doesn't make any sense. So whenever for is used, whenever the preposition is introduced, because it is used to give more clarity to the subject and what it is referring to. So when a preposition is introduced, then obviously whom has to come. That is the preferred one. So actually I have prepared up until now, and we'll stop the session today by here. And there is still a lot more to actually learn from the relative pronouns topic. There are so many examples, and there are little more things which I have to give more clarity on. There are different types of rules which gives even more clarity whenever we use whom or that. So we'll stop the session till here, and I'll continue the session from the next session.